Morning, y'all, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Jordan Green, and you're watching On Track, a weekly look at the biggest news in railroading. Now, normally we'd be talking about true news, but today I want to take us down an important sidetrack, talking about the history of railroading and the people who made this industry what it is today. So, on February 5th, I joined several of my friends in railroading at the Wichita Model Train Show. It's a spectacular weekend event at the Cessna Activity Center in Wichita, Kansas, and you really can't go wrong buying anything there. With vendors from premier model railroad stores, several local and smaller vendors with good collections of quality engines and cars, and plenty of vendors of railroad memorabilia, there's just everything you could ever want aside from maybe a diesel locomotive itself. Uh, but when I went to the show, I walked away more with stories and Santa Fe Railroad memorabilia and literature than I did model trains, and that was by my own choice. This certainly isn't to say I didn't find plenty of great model trains. I did. But I got caught up socializing with railroaders, both active and retired, and hearing their stories made the trip even more worthwhile than I could have planned for it to be. While I was walking around tables in the building, I stopped to purchase a Santa Fe Railroad timetable from the late 1980s. Now, for those of you who don't know what a timetable is, it's an old book that used to denote every Santa Fe Railroad line, every station along the line, and it was useful for figuring out where trains would run, what areas of a town they might service, and when they would be arriving. It's a really cool book, especially for those of us who are truly nerdy about trains. So I wanted to get an idea of what the track conditions along the Santa Fe's former Hutchison and Southern Division, which runs through my hometown of Blackwell, which has been scrapped for a long time. I wanted to get an idea of what that looked like in its final years. So I stopped by this unmarked booth, no signs or anything, and it was headed up by a guy wearing a Santa Fe Railroad agent's hat. Now, those hats are not exactly easy to find, so if somebody's wearing one, chances are they probably were a Santa Fe agent. And sure enough, the guy was. His name was Dick Spain, and he was a Santa Fe depot agent in three towns that I have a connection to: Blackwell, Nardin, Oklahoma, near Blackwell, and South Haven, Kansas. Now, the railroad that I work for seasonally, Blackwell Northern Gateway, of course, we run out of Blackwell, and we also run up to South Haven. Dick had worked across northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas for several years, and we had mutual friends in the railroad industry. He told me about the glory days of the Santa Fe when local trains served small communities and railroads were personable, and were friendly to the communities they passed through. Best of all, he told me about a time when railroad employees took great pride in their careers. For a variety of factors, that same passion seems hard to find among employees of modern Class 1 railroads, largely because of no fault of their own. He also told me plenty of other fun tales about railroading, and as we sat and talked, I couldn't help but reflect on just how important it is for people to understand the history of the places they work, and how important it is for that history to be preserved. People like Dick have great insight into a time in this country that was, by many accounts, better, especially in the railroad industry. The hardworking people who made the railroads such an American powerhouse have stories to tell, but as time passes, we're losing some of those great people and their stories. Now, some organizations are stepping in before it's too late and telling these kinds of stories. The Kansas Historical Society's Echoes from the Steel Rails series preserves the oral histories of railroaders like Spain, according to its website, which is an in-depth repository of history. That kind of work is so valuable, yet it's often underappreciated and not as widely available as it ought to be. Museums also play a big part in preserving these stories, but too often the focus is simply on preserving infrastructure like locomotives and freight cars. Of course, we need to preserve all of this equipment, but without the stories to accompany it, it means less. One museum that's doing it right is the B&O Railroad Museum, a Smithsonian affiliate in Baltimore, Maryland. It has an extensive collection of histories from the people who built some of the earliest rail infrastructure in America. You can find out more about the B&O and its mission to preserve history on its website. And I do want to note, a lot of railroad museums do have good websites, but some of that historical information isn't readily accessible on the site. The museum may be preserving it, but it would be helpful to people who want to study that history more if it were available on the website. That's something that I know is not necessarily easy for museums to do given staffing shortages and the fact that nobody wants to volunteer anymore and time is really short for a lot of people. But with the time they have, museums would be really wise and would do a great public service to try to better digitize some of their collections of railroad documents and to do a better job of reaching out to railroaders and preserving their oral history. And that's as simple as recording them, talking about their days on the railroad, and then collecting all of that information to be put online, even on YouTube. It really is valuable. People get a lot of joy out of watching it, and that historical information from firsthand accounts is so valuable to people who are trying to better understand this industry and how it built this country. Whenever I get a chance to visit with a railroader, I do. Their stories are exciting and always worth retelling. It's my hope that others will see the importance and the joy of sharing in and preserving railroaders' stories. Everyone has a story to tell, and all of us have a duty to listen. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of On Track. Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to us on YouTube at NWTV7. And of course, you can catch us on Twitch. I'm Jordan Green, and let's get back on track. See you next time.